Hi everybody, Dr. Rebecca Borup back again for another video lecture. This lecture is on biomolecules and molecular interactions. We'll begin by talking about chemistry. Life is chemistry. You know that all of us, are these big bags of chemical molecules. Large and small, these chemical molecules are what enable us to do all of the amazing things that we do. The cells that exist within us evolved to maximize the efficiency of these chemical reactions. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and how these things happen in order to create life, to make us live, to make us exist. Without these chemical reactions, we would just be a pile of atoms, basically. And so we're going to look at this, and I'm going to talk about some molecular interactions. First, before I get into this, let me pause and say that part of this section includes understanding the biomolecules that make up life. These would be proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids. If you don't have a good working knowledge on those molecules, I encourage you to look to other sources. I don't have them included in this PowerPoint, but you will want to read about them in your textbook or go to the videos that I provided for you on Canvas, the supplemental videos that talk about these biomolecules and introduce you to them. I'm going to assume that you have that knowledge, and with that knowledge we're going to go ahead and get into these conversations about these molecular interactions. When I talk about molecular interactions, I want you to understand that I will sometimes talk about proteins, I will sometimes talk about enzymes, but these interactions actually could be between any class of molecules. We could be dealing with small molecules such as oxygen or carbon dioxide, water, or we could be dealing with some very large molecules such as very large proteins, DNA, RNA, those lipids that we talked about. All of those count. All of those are part of these molecular interactions. And all of them have chemical properties that are the sum of all of the atomic properties of the atoms that are part of that molecule. And so we're going to be looking at those and talking about those and trying to kind of fit this all into our head. So to begin with that, I want to talk about how these chemical reactions happen and what governs those reactions. And so we're going to look at this picture here, and it's just something that I kind of doodled in PowerPoint. It's not amazing or glamorous, but I want you to think about a chemical reaction. Everything I'm going to talk about here is a chemical reaction. And I could take this diagram here and I could show you, write it in chemical reaction form as showing you this way. I could say, molecule 1 okay, there we go. Molecule 1 plus molecule 2. Didn't leave myself enough room, but we're going to do, I'm going to drop the molecule part, but the 1,2 complex. Okay? So once they bind, they form, in essence, a new molecule, which is a combination of the molecule 1 and the molecule 2. And whether or not that reaction is going to be successful will depend on molecular shape. You would have learned about this as stoichiometry in chemistry. All molecules have shape. If we think about, for example, water. If we look at the way water is, the stoichiometry, the shape of this water molecule, it is roughly speaking a triangular shape due to the nature of the bonds. So we actually have oxygen up here with an extra set of electron unbonded electrons, and so we get this triangular shape. Methane, for example, also is going to have a three-dimensional shape, and so forth and so on. And each molecule, that's the way it is. It's going to have this three-dimensional shape. And of course, the larger the molecules are, the more complicated the shape can be. And some very large molecules, such as proteins, can have very dynamic shapes that shift and change, and I like to call them breathe. They expand and contract and rotate and move. And so molecular shape is actually quite important to our ability to have these chemical reactions occurring within the body. In addition to molecular shapes, we also have to refer to the chemical properties of the atoms, and the atoms all linked together, the bonds that are formed. And so to give you kind of a visual representation of this, I've drawn this large blue blob, and you can see that this blue blob has this indentation here. And what this is going to represent, I want you to imagine that this is, let's say it's a protein, and it's going to have thousands of atoms in it: carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, nitrogen atoms, oxygen atoms, some sulfur atoms, all of these different atoms that are present within this large protein, folded into a three-dimensional structure. And in that process, a pocket is created. And in this diagram, I've drawn in that pocket some negative charges. I've lined the pocket with these negative charges, and those negative charges could be complete charges, or they could be partial charges. You'll recall the difference between ions versus polar molecules. And so if we had ionic amino acids lining that pocket, then we would have these negative charges. But if we have polar amino acids lining that pocket, then they're going to be partial charges. And then notice here molecule 2, which I've drawn as a purple blob, and I tried to draw it so that it looks like it might actually fit in the binding site, that binding pocket of molecule 1. And you'll notice that I also added positive charges to molecule 2. And so you could look at this shape and these chemical properties, and the chemical properties of, if we assume that these are both proteins, of the amino acids that make this protein and that line the binding pocket and enable these molecules to interact, well, this would be a favorable interaction. Molecule 2 would sit down into that pocket of molecule 1, and we would end up with that molecule occupying that site. And so we could kind of draw that in here, and you could see it occupying that site, my closest approximation to that molecule 2 there. And so that's important to kind of wrap your head on and think about it in these terms, that when we're interacting with these molecules, how they're sitting together and working together and becoming a complex together based on their chemical properties. And so this might be a favorable chemical reaction. We might go ahead and proceed in the direction of forming that complex of molecule 1 and 2 as a unit. Now, we can have situations where perhaps the molecular shape is correct, but the chemical properties are not. And that's also important to understand and realize. Again, if we're looking at a chemical reaction, and does this chemical reaction occur in the human body or not, it's going to depend on both shape and properties. And so if I have these negative charges occupying or as part of molecule 2, then when those negative charges try to sit down in here and bind into the pocket, these are going to push them away. It's going to repel each other. And so we're not going to have a chemical reaction in that case, because both are important. And then of course, if that binding pocket was different in shape, we wouldn't have this chemical reaction either. Everything is chemical. All of this is chemical. And